We should be the carriers of confidence. Real show is about to begin.
Okay, so thank you, both of you, Peter and Sharif, for that really engaging discussion. Enjoyed it. I'm an atheist myself, and so this question is for Sharif. Even if we accept the existence of a prime mover to explain the beginning of the universe, even if we accept that, how do you prove that this prime mover, or how do you go about proving that this prime mover is your specific God? So, the specific God of the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Good question. I think there's potentially two parts of the question. I don't know if any of these might work. I'll use that one. Sorry. Good question. I think, look, from my perspective, before we can even go into the discussion of whether the Islamic religion is actually the correct religion, you have to first accept or open up our discussion whether a creator exists or not. I do think there's a separate discussion that needs to be had. Is the Quran, is Muhammad a messenger of God? That's a separate discussion, and we still need to find certain evidences for that in order to determine whether that is strong and therefore should be adopted or not. So that's why I say if we were to focus firstly and maybe have some sort of conclusion whether a creator exists, then this opens up the discussion, well, okay, if a creator exists, sentient, chose to create, ultimately everything is built, dependent upon this creator, then naturally the next question is, well, was there some sort of communication or not? Yeah? So that's a separate discussion, and that discussion is primarily built upon whether the Quran is the revelation from this creator or not.
Okay, for the next question we'll have so the brother in the striped blue snazzy jumper.
Thank you for the discussion. My question is to Dr. Peter. In your slides, you mentioned that you would try to touch upon the purpose of life if you do not believe in the Creator.
Look, thank you for the question. Many things we didn't get to. It's part of the discussion we've just been having. The question that's usually asked is exactly yours, and it's hard for people who believe in a God to understand how an atheist might find meaning in life when, for religious people, the meaning is intimately bound up with their belief in a creator who has some special relationship with them, as I understand Islam and other traditions do. The answer is not that difficult. I often put the question back, why should my life be any less meaningful than yours? And the meaning comes from within my life, like it does for all of you. Now, you may have beliefs that are different from mine, but I suspect that the meaning of your life comes from the people you love, the people that you interact with, the things that you like doing. I have a very rich life. And it's meaningful in the way that I think life can only be meaningful. It comes from the happiness and the purposes and the significance that I find within my life. Now, because I happen to think that religious beliefs are an illusion, I think that people who believe that that's the source of their meaning are mistaken about that. Because in reality, their meaning comes, as it does for all of us, from the richness of our lives. Now that's the short answer, and it seems to me, philosophers have made light of it in a way. They ask, why should the meaning of your life come from the purpose that somebody else has for you? And one philosopher called Thomas Nagel recently says, he gives a kind of a jokey example, so if you don't mind my repeating a slightly cheeky example, he says that why should the meaning of the life of a chicken come from the fact that it's going to be my chicken salad? Now that's a kind of a smart aleck joke, but the fact that you have a life and a meaning to your life shouldn't come from somebody else's purposes for you. That's the question. And so I find it slightly odd that someone even asks why my life is meaningful, because it's meaningful in all sorts of ways. And there's no other answer to that. Now some people have meaningless lives and they, commit suicide because their life becomes pointless, but it's not because they believe in something else. It's usually because their life is miserable or some other reason, whatever. I don't understand the psychology of that. So you understand, that's the kind of answer I would give. And look, I have to confess something. I don't know if you've seen Woody Allen movies. I mean, he happens to be a New York Jew, and he agonizes about the meaning of life in exactly this way, and he tries out all the different religions. But in the end of the movie, it's very touching if you haven't seen it. He goes out when he's feeling really depressed, and he thinks he's got cancer, and it turns out he hasn't, but he's still depressed, because Woody Allen's always depressed. But he happens to find his way into a Groucho Marx movie. It's a very clever metaphor. The movie is one of these crazy, absurd things going on. The Marx brothers are doing absurd, funny stuff, and he finds himself laughing and enjoying it, and he comes out of there, and you're supposed to get the point is, look, that's the meaning of life. He says it's not all bad. That's kind of a cute way of making the point. So that's my answer.
Okay, so we'll have one final question. So we've got one person up here at the front. Yeah.
Good evening, sir. I don't know most of your name. I am come from the jungle of Cambodia, and I cannot say I'm atheist, and I cannot say I don't believe in God. Cambodia is created by, first is Hinduism, 4,000 years ago, and then Buddhism, and then Christianity, and then about nearly 1,000 years ago, Vietnam occupied Champa. Islam come to live in Cambodia. We live as a friend. Now, what we're talking about is very high level. I just been here less than 1 year. I want to learn how to write English. But my question is, can you most answer why now is a lot of blood in Syria, in Afghanistan? Okay, you know better than me. I just walk from the jungle. I'm like I just change my skin from the age. So please tell me why a lot of love. Why don't we create love instead of you are Islam, you are Christian, you are this, you are that. Don't create hate, create love between each other. That's really why love or respect.
Okay, so we might extend that question and maybe touch upon the problem of evil, Sharif. So, if God is omniscient and if He is all merciful, then why is there bloodshed in these places, and why is there so much evil?
Well, firstly, I think we have to understand that there's two questions that you're really asking. One is, what's the political reality in the Muslim world and why is there so much turmoil? And the second question is more of a philosophical question, which is, why is evil allowed to exist in the world? If I could take the first question is that the problem within the Middle East and the Muslim world is generally not a religious quote-unquote problem. It's not a problem between Muslims and Christians, or even Muslims and Jews, actually. It's a problem that the Muslims have faced in the Arab world for the last maybe 100 or so years, since the colonialism, when Western European states colonized various areas of the Muslim world. They then, through an agreement between the French and the British called the Sykes-Picot Agreement, started to carve up the land, and then through appointing certain people that they thought, or certain families that they thought would help them manage the affairs of those populations, and also provide resourcing and resources to the West, then this is what we've had. That's why, as an example of this, is Mubarak, when he was in power in Egypt, he was getting $3 billion per year by the American government. And it was military aid as well. It's going to the military, and he was obviously a military dictator. And even when Morsi was removed, who was like a generally elected leader, Sisi, now they've restarted the aid program to Sisi, who was the general that removed this elected person. So it's not surprising now that you've got a lot of instability when you have governments that don't reflect the people's opinions and values, but rather they reflect colonial or neo-colonial interests from abroad. So I'd say it's a fundamental problem of politics, effectively, and we have to look at that. Going on to the question maybe about the problem of evil, I think the issue with the problem of evil is that firstly, it assumes that we can understand what's good and evil. And these terms, good and evil, I think we mentioned it at the beginning, are relative terms. they're human subjective views about what's good and bad. And what we tend to do then is use our human subjectivity and try to force the Creator, force God to abide by our notions of good and evil. And that's obviously flawed because, can we establish good and evil as an independent, objective analysis of the universe? Or is it relational? And this is what we believe as Muslims, it's relational, built upon our viewpoint on life. So we don't see an earthquake being good or evil. We don't see a flood being good or evil. Rather, what we see is that these are events, and good and evil is how we respond to it based upon our belief system. So do we respond to it based upon its concordance to the Islamic belief, or do we go against the Islamic belief? That's how we would judge it. It's an individual approach or human approach. And I think that's a better approach because it starts to put the emphasis on the human being and how he responds, rather than start to blame the Creator for why we're in the situation we're in. As an example, Stephen Fry is a comedian, he's an actor. He was asked this question about, effectively this good and evil problem. And he said, look, I would blame God, if God exists, for why a child in Africa is, getting a parasite that buries into the eye and causes blindness. Yeah? Whereas from a Muslim point of view, we would say, why is it that we've got all of the resources in the world in order to ensure that every single human being has purified water and has the medical treatment to treat it, but we don't do that? So the good and evil for us is how we're responding to this, rather than trying to blame somebody else and think, well, we can't do anything about it.
I agree with Sharif about the first part of his answer to your question. The problem around the world, the political problems, are not caused by religion, and they're not fundamentally about religion, and that's true in the Middle East in particular. That's important to say that, and that's the kind of answer to Dawkins and Hitchens and others, so I don't have to go back over that. I think that's exactly right. Colonial and the big powers, and it's the agnostics and others. We've said that, and I agree with that. I don't want to let God off the hook so easily on the second point. God doesn't let me off the hook either. Look, the problem is this. It's not just a question of evil, it's a question of suffering. And the question which the argument of evil poses to believers, I think there's no way out of it, because it shows that there's a logical inconsistency. You can call it whatever you want, but suffering is real. And kids and animals and human beings, they're in pain, and you can't pretend that it's just a fiction or we just use a word for it. You can't, kick your dog every day and say, don't worry, it's just a word. If you're kicking a dog, you're cruel. The suffering is real, and so the difficulty for believers is, how can an omniscient and omnipotent God who could change it, why doesn't he? I don't think there's any way out of that. Maybe he's not omnipotent, maybe he's not omniscient, or maybe he's not such a good guy. And there's a whole literature, as you may be aware, of theologians struggling with how to reconcile. There's one answer, it's free will, and human beings cause evil because they choose to do bad things. But that doesn't explain the earthquake and the tsunami and things that human beings don't do and cause evil from their own meanness and cruelty. I don't think there's a way out of that. You may want to answer that.
Yeah, maybe. I think I mentioned the point, which is that we don't see good and evil as being objective, independent.
But the child is suffering. You can't say it's not objective.
No, the suffering is objective, but to then label it as being evil or to label it as being good is something separate. And what we tend to do is we tend to label these things and then superimpose our own labels upon the Creator. And I'm saying that, look, it's not an argument against God. That's what I'm saying. It's not a fundamental argument. If I was to go up to the chair and slap him in the face, he might find it suffering, he might not like it, but it doesn't mean that I don't exist.
No, the question is, what kind of God is he?
That I think the issue of the question of what kind of creator that we have, we have a creator that we believe as Muslims that has built this universe, built this life for human beings as a basis of test, that we're going to face difficulties. Why is that a positive thing for a believer, we would say? Because when people face difficulties and problems in their life, it's not they themselves are not going to be facing the whole eternity or the whole future contingent upon the material universe, and that's it. They've got a paradise. They've got the ultimate justice. As an example of this is what Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, he said amazing is the affairs of the believer, person who is a theist, who believes. Verily, all of his affairs are good. If something good happens to him, he's happy and content and gets rewarded from God. And if some harm befalls him, then he remains patient. And patience for us isn't just about sitting back, but it means persevering. It means trying to change the evil. It means being active in terms of trying to change the situation. And as a result, he will get rewarded and goodness for that. So it actually creates a person with a stable characteristic, this belief. Whereas an atheist, if some problem happens, a tsunami hits him, destroys his family, causes suffering, causes difficulty, he probably thinks, well, on the balance of it, shall I maximize my benefit? Not really much benefit there. Shall I just end it now? Or I might as well end it now. You know, it becomes that. I don't mean to be blasé about that point, but it becomes, in some people's minds, that the purpose of life is to maximize as much benefit, and if they can't get it, then there's no point, no reason to live.
Okay. We haven't had as many questions from this side of the room, so I think we'll have a couple of questions. And once this time, people have had a hand up for a while, so just 1 second, the mic coming around.
I was just wondering whether it was necessary in order to contain this kind of conversation in terms of the God's existence and the origins of the universe to the realm of science. So, and I think members of the audience are familiar with this idea that science is not the only way to come to conclusions about humanity like the universe, and there are alternative ways of doing that through authentic testimony or historical, political truths and things like that. Science can't make conclusions about moral truths or political truths or historical, aesthetic, things like that. So I guess I was just wondering, Peter, what your specific definition of the scientific method was. So, and whether that kind of encapsulated, ideas of coming to truth through historical means and things like that. And I'm sorry if this has already been addressed. So,
no, look, it's a good question to keep talking about. I mean, I'm happy to, we haven't obviously exhausted all of the discussion, so let me just readdress it in some way. Look, if you're involved in scientific disputes, I've had modest debates in psychology, for example, which is interesting because it's not like physics. It's nowhere near as advanced. And there you see it in the raw and how complicated it can be, where people disagree. And they do experiments and they interpret them in contrary ways, and it's kind of messy. And all science, especially at the forefront, is messy when it's not settled. When it's settled in a way, but even that gets overturned. So the only real answer to your question, which I can't give here, but it's the history of science. And when you read the episodes, so for example, one of the courses I teach, I mentioned the Galileo course, is a wonderfully interesting example of what is the scientific method, or the fact that there isn't a method in the sense of a set of rules, but somehow we advanced through that period and we abandoned what was the most plausible view, which was the Ptolemaic Aristotelian view, which corresponded with the scriptures at the time. It was that the earth is in the center. And how that transformation happened through conflict, through disagreement, and somehow we now have a consensus. So I can't give you a shorthand answer, but the history of science is very important in terms of to capture the idea that Sharif mentioned. If you ask what is rationality, I'll just repeat the way I put it. The scientific enterprise, with all its flaws and its limitations, as it has, is the best embodiment of our rational thinking, of our rationality. And there isn't a rule book. There is not a recipe for how to proceed. That's why they disagree with each other at the forefront. The top scientists don't agree, and there's no other way. But one method, there is one clue, and it's that you argue with each other. You disagree. That's why I mentioned the pre-Socratics. They discovered that you stand around and you challenge the orthodoxy, and it's through the argument backwards and forwards. What actually funny thing happens is individuals don't change their mind, but somehow the collectivity, the institutions make progress by coming to a consensus, and then we move from Ptolemy to Copernicus to Newton to Einstein, and you can't deny we've made progress. So something about the institution is marvelous. That's why I defer to it as the best we've got. So that's the only answer I can give.
We'll take another question from this side of the room. So, Sufyan, you've got sister up front.
The question I have is that if you follow the science, then can you explain why every scientific knowledge that is mentioned in the Quran, how it's true? The fact that, and the biggest example is mankind. How, sorry. how the creation of man was found out before the scientific knowledge. The Quran was revealed 40,000 years ago. Yet the discovery of the science was found years after that. How can that be true?
So the question is about statements about science and so forth in the Quran that later sort of, you could argue have been verified, and whether the Quran itself and the information it contains, centuries ahead of this verification, is an independent proof.
Yeah, look, it's a good question. I'll give it to Sharif in a second, but my view is, of course, that the idea that scriptures that were written a long time ago somehow really anticipated what we only found out later is just reading things backwards. You can read any book with metaphorically, or read into it words which were not understood or not intended at the time. Every scripture, every religious group does that. That's why the Christians will, and like perhaps Muslims as well, will read Big Bang cosmology into the words of let's say, the Old Testament, that there's a creation. Well, they didn't mean that, they didn't understand that. And Galileo explained that. He says, look, these books were written by people for ordinary folks back then, a couple of thousand years ago or whenever it was, and you can't really seriously imagine that they anticipated what now we find out through this extraordinary sophistication of our science. Now, you can read any book and read things into it, but then the question is whether they really intended what we now today understand. And the question then becomes, why take seriously something which had to have been confirmed by science? And then there are all the things that they got wrong. So you can't just cherry pick and choose the bits that they now appear to have got right. There's a lot of things they say that are just flatly wrong. So you can't just pick and choose. Maybe Sharif wants to come back into that.
To some extent, I agree with some of the points that Peter has mentioned, which is that there is a tendency, even amongst Muslims, to retrospectively try and read the Quran and then trying to point out, look, the concordance with the scientific knowledge of that time, and therefore say it predicted it. But there are certain things within the verses of Quran which are interesting. For example, it does mention the expansion of the universe as one example, and that's quite precise. And there are other things which are in concordance to what we know in terms of embryology as well. But I just wanted to take maybe another point, which is what the person asked at the top about the issue of science. See, I take a different approach, which I don't just see science as just being rational inquiry. I see science as a particular method and particular approach. I see science that is built upon certain axioms that it has to assume, and it results in inductive conclusions, meaning conclusions which are generalized based upon local experiments. And that's why people like Karl Popper, he said, who's this empiricist, believed in science, he said things like, you know, we can't say hypothesis is absolutely true, is definite. All we can say is the hypothesis is valid until it's been disproven. And experiments are designed to try and disprove hypothesis as opposed to being able to prove a hypothesis. And this is something even Richard Dawkins talks about in his God Delusion, where he quotes or he talks about Karl Popper's falsifiability as a test for a scientific discussion. But the point is that if you really take Karl Popper's position, and I'm talking about maybe not Dr. Slivak, but maybe Richard Dawkins' conclusion, then no scientific theories, even if they're substantiated by localized experimental results, can actually say to be true. All you can say is a science is valid until somebody's disproven it. So you can't actually, so there's an epistemic problem when it comes to the issue of science in ascertaining truths. The other thing with regards to science, just to mention as well, is that science and scientific theories become paradigms by which we start to understand the universe and understand the world. An example of this is that they found that galaxies around the stars around the edges of galaxies rotated at the same speed as the stars within the center. Now, according to Newtonian physics and the laws of gravity, the stars at the outer end should fly away. Yeah, they shouldn't be going at the same speed. If they are, then they would leave the galaxy. Now, what they then said is, well, look, either theory of gravity is wrong, and we have to completely change our theory of gravity, or theory of gravity is correct, but there is a cause. Notice how they're looking at an event and they're sensing there must be a cause. And the cause that they came up with, which fit the predictions and the mathematical equations, was dark matter. So they said dark matter, which cannot be seen, which cannot be sensed, which directly sensed, which cannot be, directly understood, but must exist because of the behavior of stars and and how it exhibits or it creates gravity upon the galaxy's rotation, so that the theory of gravity can remain consistent. So what happens is that scientific theories become like this. So 1, it's inductive; 2, it's built upon causal principles; 3, is that scientific theories can become paradigms by which we then interpret further data as well.
Okay, so it's been a long night, so this will be the final question. And we have one person up front who's been very eager. So do we need the mic? Yeah, we do. Have that up front. Peter might recognize his face.
Yeah. Thanks, Peter, for a very interesting discussion. I wanted to just build on what the sister up there asked a few moments ago. I feel, and I'll be frank, within the bounds of respect, but I feel that you've collapsed knowledge very conveniently into science. So we were discussing, back during the discussion with Sharif, between the two of you, and there was discussion of historical narrative or testimony. You said, well, that's a type of science, right? I think that's a bit. I think that's being a bit kind to science and to the scientific method. And I think you've left it at a level of abstraction, whereby science and the scientific method becomes undefinable. So it's literally, at one point you actually said, it's like common sense. Doing common sense. Now, if that is what science is, and I'm completely willing to accept that definition, if for argument's sake we want to, then we have to accept that other common sense approaches to establishing truth, such as narrative, such as historical testimony, or, and this is the point that we would make, rational axioms, which are true by the premises on which they are built, they also become a form of evidence and knowledge. And so they fit within this realm that you're describing as science. So why would that not be something that we allow to be admissible for the establishment of truths if, as you're saying, all of this is encompassed within what we might call science? Now, obviously, I actually feel that, as I said, it's being kind of science, that these are different realms of inquiry and different forms of establishing truth. One is the rational method, one is the truth established by testimonies and so forth. But you, I think, have been very, very broad in your definition of science. Why have you done that, and how would you answer the contention I've made?
Look, there's a lot of questions in there. See if I can focus it a little bit. I include history because history is what you might just call empirical inquiry. There's physics, there's biology, there's economics. There are a lot of inquiries, and they have different methods and they have different kinds of evidence. So I'm not quite sure why testimony, I responded to the question before only because testimony is one sometimes not very adequate form of evidence, and I'm not sure why Islam depends so much, except in the sense that there's a tradition that's handed down from the Prophet. So I understand that, but that's like all testimony, and I don't know how one would place more weight on that than one does on testimony. So that's not outside of the realm of science. You think I'm somehow being unfair, but it's like history generally. You see, one of the debates that I've had with other faiths is precisely that they do rely on testimony. And then, I don't deny the historicity. We know about Julius Caesar, and we have documents, and there's lots of history. So I don't see any problem with acknowledging that history is a form of inquiry with all its advantages and disadvantages, and that's to be discussed as a separate form of inquiry. But the thing that I think both of you keep reverting to, which does deserve some discussion, is the idea of an axiom. I did say, if I could repeat a little bit, there's no axioms in science. There's nothing that you start with as given. My analogy of the boat is the relevant one. Everything is open for revision, whether you call it falsification or not. And that's an important principle. Mind you, I have to add, in relation to that, not only are there no axioms, scientists actually often behave as though they are committed to some principles that they don't give up easily. Popper was wrong about that. Scientists actually don't behave as rationally as he thought. They just hang on to certain things regardless of whether the theories and the evidence reject it, because we're human and we have commitments. So when we talk about axioms, we won't be able to spell this all out, but my view is there is no such thing as anything that deserves to be called an axiom except in mathematics. And that's why science is this open inquiry where everything goes. That's the only short answer I can give. Sharif.
I'm not sure if we get a summing up. Do we get a summing up?
If you want.
Yeah, I think the brother, he mentioned at the beginning, which is that, look, what is the actual definition of science? And Peter's response has been that there are no key axioms to science. I'd probably disagree with that. I think one of the key axioms is this idea that you can generalize from specific results. And so long as you do lots of repetition, you can make generalized statements. Like water boils at 100 degrees Celsius, it's not because we've sensed or we boiled all water in the universe, but rather we boiled water in our school, laboratories at school or whatever, done the experiment with the thermometer, tested the beaker of water and it boiled at 100 degrees Celsius, and then we say all water boils, at room conditions. That is an axiom, That is where you are generalizing, or reductionist approach, where you're generalizing the local event and making a general statement, inductive approach. Otherwise, you can't make any statements on science. Otherwise, you can't say, why would the plane fly in a particular way it flies, the laws of thermodynamics, the general physical laws, because they're all generalizations upon local experiments. And for those physical laws to work, you either have to sense all of the universe to come to that conclusion, or you sense part of the universe through your experiments and then generalize and assume that your generalization will hold true. That's my point about it being part of an axiom. The other point is that this also goes back to the other point, which is my argument wasn't rested upon science, it rested upon rationality. When I mean by rationality, I said that when we sense the universe, we sense that it is limited, it's finite, it's dependent, and things within it are limited and dependent as well. And that either there are potential possibilities out there. So we try to be as open as possible in terms of the potential possibilities, either an infinite regression, either cyclical or mutual dependency, either universe from nothing, or either there must be something that initiated it which itself is independent outside of this causal realm. And that's what, and I gave various analogies and examples to show and demonstrate. If I was to expect a rebuttal, I would expect a rebuttal to at least give the potential understanding where an infinite regression could potentially exist. I also said that even if we say that science one day may explain something else, well, that's like you're putting faith in science. Like you have certain believers, they'll say God explains everything. Well, one day science will explain everything as well. And I think what we need to do is look at the evidence that we have, the implications of the observed event, which lead us to certain conclusions. And as a final remark, I'd probably say is that when we look at this subject matter, there will always be differences and debates and discussions. But I think it's important as Muslims that we continue to have these types of discussions and dialogues in order to show that, at the very least, it breaks the stereotypes that Muslims are these very angry people that are always trying to, blow things up or cut people's heads off or whatever. So, it is good to have these types of discussions, and it's good to have the sincerity and the honesty to have robust disagreements as well.
So I really do thank Peter Slezak and also the organisers for organising this event. Thank you very much.